They told us to forget. They buried the truth under centuries of silence. But time, no matter how distorted by power or washed clean by conquest, always whispers to those willing to listen. Today we listen not just with our ears, but with our hearts, our minds, and our spirits. Because something sacred has been hidden from us. A book, a testimony, a timeline that connects us not just to history, but to our identity, our legacy, our divine rhythm. I'm talking about the Book of Jubilees, a scripture stripped from the pages of accepted doctrine, dismissed by councils and empires who feared the truth it carried. A book rooted in sacred time, bound in African soil, and pulsing with the heartbeat of a people who walked with God before the world ever learned to kneel. Why was this book removed? Why would men of faith exclude a text that aligns the stars, the moon, and the calendar of heaven with such clarity and beauty? The answer lies not just in theology, but in control. Control of time, control of identity, and control of who gets to be called chosen. Because you see, the Book of Jubilees does something radical. It recenters the origin of divine law and sacred time in a place many never expected, Africa. Not just metaphorically, but literally. The timeline begins in the land of Eden in the east, where the rivers flowed out of what we now understand as Northeast Africa. This is not just a detail, this is the foundation of something powerful. A truth that can restore dignity, direction, and divine alignment to people who have been told for too long that their role in the biblical story is marginal or non-existent. The Book of Jubilees is not merely a retelling of Genesis and Exodus, it's a reordering of time itself. It doesn't rely on the lunar calendar like many traditions adopted later. Instead, it follows a 64-day solar calendar, a perfect, unbroken cycle reflecting divine order. Why does that matter? Because when you distort time, you distort destiny. The calendar you follow determines the rhythm of your feasts, your fasts, your worship, your rest. To follow a broken calendar is to walk out of sync with heaven. Jubilees calls us back. It anchors us to the Sabbath in its original timing. It restores the appointed times of the Most High. And in doing so, it restores us to ourselves. But this restoration was dangerous. It meant the people who had been scattered, those taken in chains across oceans, those whose kingdoms were erased from the maps, those whose temples were burned and rewritten in foreign tongues, might realize they are not at the margins of God's story, but at its center. That the ancient patriarchs walked the same lands their ancestors did. That Abraham's journey began in Ur, but was fulfilled in the land of Canaan, a land tethered to African geography. That Joseph ruled in Egypt, not as a foreigner in skin, but as one familiar with its soil. That Moses, raised in the palace of Pharaoh, did not look like a stranger among Africans, but as one of their own. That the children of Israel journeyed not through some mythic realm, but across terrains their descendants still inhabit. These connections are not accidental, they're providential. The removal of the Book of Jubilees wasn't just about doctrine, it was about disconnection. Because when a people know their roots, they rise. When a people know their divine timeline, they walk in divine authority. And so the book was hidden, marginalized, branded as apocryphal, even heretical. But make no mistake, the ones who buried it knew its power. They knew it told a different story, one that couldn't be used to justify slavery, colonization, or cultural erasure. Because it placed Africa not as a backdrop to salvation history, but as its womb. The Book of Jubilees names names. It gives clarity to the generations. It identifies Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and maps out the inheritance of nations with breathtaking detail. And in that clarity, it honors Africa not as cursed, but as chosen. It doesn't distort the story of Ham's descendants into a false justification for bondage. Instead, it uplifts the nations that came from him, nations of strength, science, and spiritual depth. Kingdoms that built wonders still standing today. Civilizations that encoded wisdom in stone, mathematics in architecture, and prophecy in their bloodlines. The book doesn't just trace geography, it restores genealogy. It restores the true identity of people who have been told their story began in slavery, when in fact it began in Egypt. Why don't they teach you this? Because if you truly knew who you were, you wouldn't settle for survival. You would reclaim your birthright. You would walk in royalty. You would no longer wear shame like skin. You would no longer accept the scraps of broken history rewritten by empires that fear your awakening. You would walk in step with divine time, not Gregorian distortions, but sacred cycles. You would celebrate Passover in its fullness, honor Sabbath in its rightful place, and anticipate Jubilee with holy expectation. The word Jubilee means release, restoration, freedom. It's not just about time, it's about timing. The acceptable year of the Lord. The time when captives go free, debts are canceled, land is returned, and identity is restored. That's what this book was declaring. That's what made it dangerous to those who profit from oppression. Because Jubilee threatens systems built on generational theft. It reminds people that what was taken will be returned, that what was lost will be restored, that the broken calendar of your life, the seasons of pain, exile, and confusion, can be realigned with heaven. The Book of Jubilees doesn't just teach history, it teaches healing. We were not meant to wander in confusion. We were not meant to live by foreign rhythms. We were not meant to see ourselves only in the margins of another man's scripture. We were meant to walk in the fullness of our story. We were meant to know the times and the seasons, to discern what heaven is saying, to honor sacred time, sacred land, and sacred lineage. This book, though excluded from the canon, carries that revelation. It carries a frequency of truth that resonates with the soul of a people who have been misnamed, displaced, and disinherited. But no longer. The awakening is happening. All over the world, people of African descent are rising. Not in rebellion, but in remembrance. They are remembering the rhythm of their ancestors. They are remembering that they were priests, kings, judges, and prophets. They are remembering that Africa was not a dark continent, but a continent of light. They are remembering that time itself once flowed from their lands. And they are remembering the Book of Jubilees, not as a relic of the past, but as a roadmap for restoration. You may wonder, what do we do now? We study, we seek, we question. We no longer accept erasure. We honor the scriptures that speak to our spirit, not just those sanctioned by empire. We listen for truth, even when it comes wrapped in controversy. And most of all, we reclaim time, not just in dates and calendars, but in how we live. We reclaim our Sabbaths. We reclaim our feasts. We reclaim our rest, our worship, our seasons. Because when we align with heaven's time, we align with heaven's power. This is not about rebellion against tradition. It's about return to truth. A truth older than cathedral. A truth rooted in mountains like Sinai. A truth whispered through generations, now being shouted from the rooftops. You are not lost. You were never lost. The truth was buried, but not destroyed. Just like seeds in the soil, it was only waiting for the right time to rise. And that time is now. This isn't just history. This is destiny. The Book of Jubilees may have been removed from the table, but its message has never left the hearts of those it was meant for. And today, it calls out again. Can you hear it? It's the sound of restoration, the sound of sacred time ticking back into place, the sound of chains breaking. Not just physical chains, but mental ones, spiritual ones. The sound of a people no longer defined by captivity, but by covenant. You were born with purpose. Your time matters. Your ancestors matter. Your history matters. And no council, no empire, no scholar can erase what God has ordained. So rise up, walk in rhythm with the Most High. Open the books they told you to ignore. Seek the stories they tried to erase. Because the truth is not lost. It's just been waiting for you to find it. And once you do, the world will never look the same. Because when you know who you are, when you know where you come from, when you know the sacred time that beats in your bones, you will walk in power, you will speak with fire, and you will live like you were always meant to, free, whole, and right on time. Just because something has been buried does not mean it is forgotten. Just because it has been hidden does not mean it no longer exists. The truth does not die simply because powerful men try to silence it. The truth waits. The truth endures. The truth lives underground, like a seed planted in the dark. And when the right season comes, that seed cracks open and pushes through the soil, reaching for the sun. The Book of Jubilees was not removed because it was unimportant. It was not excluded because it was irrelevant. It was removed because it carried a power too deep, too clear, too connected to something ancient, something divine for empire to accept. But its removal did not erase its voice. It did not destroy its meaning. The Book of Jubilees still speaks, just as loudly, just as boldly, just as purposefully to those who have ears to hear. It still pulses with divine memory, calling back those who have been scattered, disconnected, and told to forget. Truth buried is not truth erased. It is truth waiting, and that waiting has come to an end. There is a moment in every journey where the traveler must stop and ask not just where they are going, but where they have come from. When truth is buried, the path forward becomes unclear. The steps feel shaky, the time feels off, and that is what the removal of the Book of Jubilees did to generations. It took the divine compass, the sacred clock, and it hid it behind the curtains of power. But now in this hour, that clock is ticking again. That compass is pointing again, and it's calling us home, not just to a physical location, but to a deeper awareness, a deeper knowing, a deeper truth. The truth that our time has always mattered, that our story was never secondary, that Africa's role in divine history was not marginal but foundational, that the sacred time God gave was a gift to all people, but especially to those who walked with him from the beginning. The ones whose footsteps marked Eden, the ones whose bloodlines flowed through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the ones whose sacred rhythm echoed from Egypt to Canaan to Cush. That truth is alive again. And once it rises, it cannot be buried again. For so long, we were told our story started in chains, that we were nameless, faceless, voiceless, until someone else came along and gave us meaning. But the Book of Jubilees tells a different story, a story older than captivity, a story rooted in creation, a story where African soil cradled the footsteps of prophets, a story where sacred festivals and holy times were tied not to man-made calendars, but to the heavens. That story was buried but not broken, covered but not crushed. It was waiting, waiting for a people strong enough to question, humble enough to seek, brave enough to remember. And now that remembering is shaking the foundations of everything we thought we knew. Because when buried truth rises, it doesn't whisper, it roars. The lie was that forgotten meant finished, that hidden meant useless, that removed meant irrelevant. But nothing could be further from the truth. The Most High does not forget. He does not erase what he ordains, and he does not let his people walk in darkness forever. The Book of Jubilees was never meant to stay buried. It was placed underground so that in a future time, the people who needed it most would find it, dust it off, open its pages, and rediscover their place in God's divine time. This isn't just about a missing book. This is about a missing identity, a missing rhythm, a missing inheritance. But what was missing is now returning. What was buried is now blooming. What was hidden is now being held in the hands of those it was always meant for. We live in a world that has manipulated time, that has replaced divine order with confusion, that has taken the sacred and made it secular, taken the prophetic and turned it into politics. But divine truth cannot be distorted forever. It will always rise. It may take generations. It may face resistance. It may be labeled, dismissed, and disqualified. But when God speaks through something, his voice will echo until the right ears hear it. And now the ears are listening. The eyes are opening. The hearts are turning. Because the season of truth's silence has ended. This is the season of uncovering, of realignment, of restoration. The Book of Jubilees was buried for a time, but now is the time of its revelation. This isn't just about theology. It's about identity. It's about power. It's about returning to the foundation. It's about knowing that the Most High created time, not for confusion, but for clarity. That His appointed times are not suggestions, but sacred alignments. That the cycles and seasons of heaven were given as gifts, not burdens. And that the calendar we follow shapes the life we live. The world's systems took that away. They buried it under tradition and doctrine. But heaven never forgot. The book was removed, but the memory remained. The book was excluded, but the message endured. And now it returns not as a weapon, but as a witness to who we really are, a witness to where we really come from, a witness to what has always been ours. Truth never dies. It sleeps, it waits, it watches, and then it rises. And when it does, no man, no council, no institution can bury it again. The Book of Jubilees is rising again. Its truth is marching forward. And as it marches, it calls us back to sacred time, to sacred purpose, to sacred roots. What was once buried is now a banner waving in the wind of awakening. And that banner declares to all who see, this is your time. This is your truth. This is your return. Empires have always reached for control, not just of land, not just of people, but of time itself. To govern a people's time is to govern their worship, their rest, their festivals, their very relationship with the divine. When rulers shape calendars, they don't simply create a way to measure days. They create a rhythm, and whoever dances to that rhythm is drawn into alignment with the system that made it. But divine time was never meant to be subject to kings and councils. The Most High established time not by decree of men, but by the movement of the heavens. He aligned sacred moments with the sun, the stars, the seasons. It was never meant to be manipulated. It was never meant to be twisted, but it was. And the greatest tragedy is that many who live under that distortion don't even realize it. They keep time, but not sacred time. They follow days, but not divine direction. They celebrate, but out of sync with the Creator's intention. That's not just misalignment, it's disinheritance. The Book of Jubilees gives us a glimpse into time before it was tampered with, a time when the days, the weeks, the months, and the years flowed in perfect balance with the Creator's design. The calendar outlined in that book wasn't based on shadows or shifting moons. It was rooted in the steady cycle of the sun, moving in 3, divisible by 7, ensuring every Sabbath landed on the same day year after year. There was no guesswork, no confusion. It's consistent, deliberate, holy, and that consistency reflected the nature of the one who created it. Unchanging, eternal, precise. But when men seeking power and dominion changed the calendar, they weren't just changing dates, they were changing destiny. They were leading generations away from the appointed times of heaven. They were placing people out of step with the divine rhythm and into step with earthly agendas. And when you fall out of rhythm with heaven, you fall into patterns of confusion, compromise, and captivity. This wasn't accidental, it was intentional. To strip people of divine time is to disconnect them from divine blessing, because the appointed times of the Most High were not only dates, they were covenants. The Sabbath wasn't merely rest, it was a sign between God and His people. The feasts weren't mere rituals, they were windows into redemption, prophetic pictures of things to come. When you remove or rearrange these markers, you blur the image of God's plan. You create noise where there was once music. You replace revelation with repetition. You give people religion without rhythm. That is what empire has done for centuries. They have wrapped distortion in doctrine, wrapped control in tradition, and handed it to the masses as truth. But the truth cannot stay hidden forever. The restoration of sacred time is not rebellion, it is returning. It is stepping back into the harmony of heaven. It is remembering what was stolen, broken, changed, and reclaiming what has always been ours. The Book of Jubilees reminds us that time is not a tool of control, it is a gift of covenant. It is a divine inheritance passed down not through papal authority or imperial decrees, but through the breath of the Creator Himself. And when a people return to that time, they return to clarity. They begin to see the connections between their lives and the heavens. They begin to understand why certain seasons feel heavy and others feel full. They begin to walk in sync with divine purpose, not just religious routine. And that alignment becomes power. That alignment becomes identity. That alignment becomes freedom. This is not just about knowing dates, it's about living in tune with a frequency that creation itself obeys. The sun doesn't rise and set based on human calendars. The stars don't shift their course because of Roman reform. The heavens declare the glory of God with every sunrise, with every solstice, with every equinox, and those declarations are not random. They are precise. They are prophetic. They are intentional, and the Book of Jubilees understood that. It taught that sacred time was woven into the very fabric of creation, and that to follow that time was to walk in wisdom, protection, and blessing. That's why it was removed. That's why it was called dangerous. Because when people align with divine time, they stop depending on broken systems. They stop being controlled by chaos. They start walking in order, in strength, in revelation. To embrace divine time is to embrace who you really are. It is to remember that you were created not to follow man's clock, but to live by the heartbeat of heaven. The 3064-day calendar was not just an ancient concept, it was a blueprint for living. A calendar where every month had exactly 4 weeks, where every quarter had an added day of remembrance, where every Sabbath fell consistently, reminding the people not just of rest, but of relationship. That level of structure wasn't rigid, it was liberating. Because in that structure, people were free. Free from the unpredictability of human systems. Free from the manipulation of religious powers. Free to rest when God said rest. Free to gather when God said gather. Free to live by a higher order. The world teaches us that time is money, time is pressure, time is running out. But the Book of Jubilees teaches us that time is sacred. That time is relational. That time, when aligned with the Creator, becomes a sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, we find peace. We find purpose. We find alignment with the eternal. That's why the battle over time is so fierce. That's why the distortion of calendars is not a small issue. It's a spiritual war. Because whoever controls your time controls your life. And whoever restores your time restores your destiny. Returning to the divine rhythm of the Creator is not an intellectual exercise, it's a spiritual awakening. It's the sound of chains falling off as we stop moving to the beat of empires and start dancing again to the rhythm of heaven. The Book of Jubilees was never a threat because of its words alone. It was a threat because it offered a return to clarity, a return to divine order, a return to a rhythm that could set a people free. And freedom has always terrified those who build their thrones on oppression. But now the time has come. The buried is rising. The forgotten is being remembered. The sacred calendar of the Most High is being heard again in the hearts of those ready to live not by man's standard, but by God's. And as we realign, we rise. As we remember, we walk forward. Not in confusion, but in divine confidence. Not in man's time, but in eternal timing. Not governed by empire, but guided by eternity. They told us Africa was merely a footnote, a side character in a grand story written elsewhere. They claimed the foundation of sacred history came from other lands, other names, other faces. But what if the beginning was never over there, but right here? What if the root was never on the outside, but deep in the very soil so many have been taught to forget? The truth is not new. It has always been. It was simply covered, silenced by systems built on distortion. But distortion cannot change origin. The beginning remains the beginning, whether men honor it or hide it. Africa was never added to the story. It has always been the place where the sacred began. The rivers named in the earliest pages of divine scripture flowed through her earth. The names that carried the promises of the Most High were born of her blood. The geography of holiness and the foundation of divine relationship is tied to the same soil that has been stripped, exploited, and rewritten by those afraid of what it truly holds. The Book of Jubilees doesn't ask for permission to tell the truth, it declares it. It reaffirms what the first chapters of time already showed us, that the cradle of civilization, the dwelling place of early covenants, the path of patriarchs, was none other than Africa and the regions connected to her body. It doesn't remove her voice, it centers it. It doesn't erase her people, it identifies them. And in doing so, it calls those who have been scattered, those who have been mislabeled and dismissed, to rise in understanding and walk in truth. Not a truth manufactured by men, but a truth inscribed in the movements of the sun, the structure of sacred time, and the footprints of prophets whose stories have been misappropriated. Africa's role was never accidental. It wasn't coincidental. It wasn't incidental. It was intentional. It was chosen. It was ordained. The idea that Africa came later, that her people were merely recipients of someone else's blessing, has been used to erase dignity, to justify oppression, and to rewrite the timeline of divine history. But when you open the pages of the Book of Jubilees, when you examine the genealogies, when you look at the land divisions among the sons of Noah, you see something undeniable. The inheritance was not handed down to Africa as an afterthought. It was embedded in the very origin of divine purpose. The land was named, the borders were marked, and the people were acknowledged long before any empire ever existed. And yet, through centuries of rewriting, those names were stripped, those borders were blurred, and that acknowledgement was buried. To reclaim this truth is not to rewrite history, it is to finally read it rightly. It is not a rejection of others, but a recognition of what has always been. Africa is not the background. Africa is not the supporting character. She is the foundation, the original stage upon which the Creator walked with his people, made covenants, issued commandments, and established divine time. And if the foundation is holy, then all that rises from it must be honored. That includes the people. That includes their story. That includes their spiritual identity. That includes their authority to remember who they are, where they come from, and what was always theirs before it was stolen, twisted, or forgotten. The Book of Jubilees, by restoring geography and genealogy, restores identity. It lifts the veil placed over generations, taught to see themselves through the eyes of colonizers and theologians who excluded them from the sacred narrative. But exclusion by men is not the same as rejection by God. The presence of Africa in the foundation of sacred time is not symbolic, it is structural. You cannot remove her without collapsing the whole house. That's why the truth had to be hidden. Because once people realize the land they were taught to fear or pity is the very ground where divine purpose was first planted, everything changes. They walk differently. They think differently. They pray differently. They stop looking outside themselves for validation and start looking within their heritage for truth. This awakening is not about pride. It's about placement. It's about understanding that the script was never supposed to be in the hands of the oppressor. The script was never supposed to erase the first actors. The first chapters of sacred time speak of Africa not in metaphor, but in location, not as an idea, but as the landscape of holy events. From Eden's proximity to the rivers of Cush, to the migrations of the patriarchs, to the presence of prophecy and wisdom flowing out of African regions, it is clear that this continent is not just part of the story. It is the ground upon which the story stood. And when that is understood, the chains of inferiority break. The silence enforced by stolen narratives is shattered. And the people rise, not in arrogance, but in understanding. The Book of Jubilees, through its divine precision, maps out a heritage many have been told never existed. It gives clarity to confusion. It shines light where there has only been shadow. It opens the door to a restored sense of belonging for people who have been wandering, searching, hoping for something more than survival. It is not just a book, it is a mirror. It reflects what has always been true, even when the world refused to see it. Africa was not discovered. Africa was not saved by the outside world. Africa was the source from which knowledge, faith, and covenant flowed. And it still flows. This truth is not new, it is eternal. It is in the breath of ancestors. It is in the memory carried in bones, in language, in song, in blood. It is in the rhythm of drums that mirror the pulse of divine time. It is in the soil that still holds the echoes of sacred footsteps. It is in the hearts of the descendants who were told their worth began in chains, but are now remembering their crowns. It was always there, it was always waiting. And now that the truth is returning, it cannot be stopped. It cannot be silenced. It cannot be Africa is not behind the story. She is before it. Not beneath it, but beneath its foundation. Her place is not an addition, it is original. And her people spread across the earth must know that their dignity was never given by empire. It was never granted by colonizers. It was never earned by submission. It was always theirs. It was planted by the Creator himself. And no matter how far they have been scattered, the call to remember is echoing louder. The Book of Jubilees is part of that call. A call to rise. A call to reconnect. A call to reclaim what was never truly lost, only hidden. Hidden, not because it was weak, but because it was powerful, because it was sacred, because it was central. And now that center is being restored. Memory is more than recollection. It is restoration. It is the bridge that connects the past to the present, that binds a people to their origin, their name, their purpose. When memory is taken, the soul drifts. The voice grows faint. The spirit begins to wear chains, even if the body is free. That is why so much effort was spent erasing memory, distorting names, deleting lineages, rewriting maps, and severing the ties between people and their beginnings. The Book of Jubilees was not removed because it lacked truth. It was removed because it guarded too much of it. Truth that could wake the descendants of those who were scattered. Truth that could expose the cracks in the stories we were taught to trust. Truth that could revive what was buried, not just pages, but people. This book doesn't simply tell stories, it restores memories. It speaks to the origin of families, the journey of nations, the divine inheritance carved into the soil long before empires built their thrones on it. The names within its chapters matter. The places it mentions are more than locations. They are spiritual markers. They trace a path through time that reveals where we've come from, who we belong to, and what was always meant to be ours. It doesn't reduce Africa to a place on the sidelines. It places her firmly in the beginning, in the land of first blessings, in the center of divine appointments. When we see ourselves in these texts, we remember we were never strangers to the story. We were never outsiders to covenant. We were always a part of the plan. When you lose memory, you lose direction. You forget not just your past, but the weight of your name. You forget the sacredness of your bloodline. You forget the value of your ancestors' tears, the purpose in their walk, and the reason they endured. But when memory returns, everything begins to realign. Your posture changes. You stop bowing to lesser identity. You stop accepting narratives written to keep you small. You stop seeing your heritage as broken and begin to understand that it was stolen, edited, hidden, but never destroyed. The Book of Jubilees returns what was taken. It brings clarity to generations that have wandered in spiritual fog, unsure of where they belong or whether they even matter in the divine story. It's not just about remembering names on a list. It's about remembering that those names were holy, that those lands were assigned with purpose, that the separation of peoples after the flood was not random, but intentional, orchestrated by the Creator himself, that the inheritance of Africa was not cursed, but chosen, that the children of Ham, Shem, and Japheth were each given territories and legacies by the divine hand, that nothing about who you are is accidental. The lies that were told to justify conquest and slavery worked to strip that understanding away. But the truth never stopped existing. It waited for ears ready to hear, for hearts open to reclaim what was silent. When you see your story in the scriptures come alive. They stop being someone else's testimony and start becoming your own. To remember is to return. To return is to realign, and to realign is to Identity is not something given by governments, stamped by birth certificates, or confirmed by institutions. Identity comes from the Creator, from the origin, from the root. And that root is sacred. That root is memory. That root is what keeps a tree from falling in storm. When you know who you are, you cannot be uprooted by the winds of lies. You do not chase after borrowed images or artificial value. You walk in what you already possess. The Book of Jubilees doesn't give us something new. It reminds us of what was always, and in doing so, it restores a people long told they were nothing but labor, nothing but property, nothing but shadows. But they were never shadows. They were light. They were never forgotten. They were hidden, and now the veil is lifted. There is something powerful about memory that touches not just the mind, but the soul. It awakens you. It fuels the fire in your bones. It makes the impossible feel reachable because it tells you it already was. It tells you that what others thought began in chains began in covenant. That what others claimed was lost is waiting to be uncovered. That what others destroyed still lives in the names, the songs, the languages, and the stories your ancestors whispered even when their voices were trembling. That memory was passed down, even if it was faint, even if it had no book, even if it was carried in the rhythm of the drum, the sway of the dance, the hush of the prayer. The Book of Jubilees affirms what your spirit already knew, that you are not a mistake. You are not a coincidence. You are not late to the story. You were written in from the beginning. The world told you to forget. They said your story didn't matter. They pointed to brokenness and told you it was all you'd ever known. But the Creator wrote something different. And that writing is still alive, still pulsing, still waiting for eyes that refuse to look away. Memory is more than nostalgia. It's a map. It leads you back to your source. It carries the whispers of Eden. It carries the strength of those who walked through deserts and crossed rivers and built kingdoms that the world has tried to erase. That memory is yours. It belongs to you. It is your inheritance. And once you claim it, nothing can take it again. Sacred memory gives birth to sacred identity, and sacred identity cannot be stolen, only forgotten. But even forgotten truth waits to be remembered. And the moment you remember, truly remember, you begin to see the world through different eyes. You begin to speak with authority. You begin to love your skin, your hair, your history, your name, because you understand that they were formed with purpose, not to be rejected, but to be revered, not to be tolerated, but to be celebrated. The Book of Jubilees, by restoring memory, returns what oppression tried to erase. It is more than a book. It is a mirror, a reminder, a witness to who you've always been. Not a slave, not a mistake, not a stranger, but a child of covenant, a keeper of time, a bearer of truth, a reflection of divine intention. Reclaiming what was taken is not only an act of courage, it is an act of survival, of healing, of returning to the place where wholeness begins. Before freedom is lived, it must be remembered. And before it is remembered, it must be uncovered. No chain ever forged could silence the truth forever. No power, no empire, no decree can erase what the Creator has marked as eternal. And when a people rise to rediscover what was hidden from them, what was denied, buried, stripped, stolen, they are not merely reclaiming information. They are reigniting identity. They are awakening a spirit that generations tried to put to sleep. That is what happens when something sacred, like the Book of Jubilees, reemerges in a world that forgot it ever existed. It brings with it not just history, but restoration. Not just stories, but strategy. Not just facts, but fire. The journey to become whole again begins by asking the right questions. Who are we? Where did we begin? What was taken from us and why? When we begin to peel back the layers of distortion placed over our origins, we begin to see clearly the ways in which our spiritual birthrights were rewritten. The Book of Jubilees is a book that brings light to what was kept in the dark. It brings order to what was twisted. It brings dignity to those who were told their ancestors were only laborers and not leaders, only victims and not vessels of divine instruction. And in restoring that truth, it opens a door, not just for reflection, but for freedom. Because to reclaim what was forgotten is to unlock the chains wrapped around the soul, the mind, and the purpose of a people. This book, long removed from common scripture, never lost its meaning. It never lost its weight. It was simply taken out of reach. It was removed not because it confused, but because it clarified. It gave names, lineages, instructions, and timing that empowered those reading it to walk in awareness. It affirmed sacred appointments and divine cycles. It reminded those who had forgotten what covenant truly meant. But more than that, it boldly pointed back to a land, to a people, to a continent where divine interaction and divine presence were deeply rooted. That kind of truth could not remain on the shelf. It had to be hidden, because if the descendants of those named in its pages were to rediscover who they were, it would mark the beginning of an awakening the world could not contain. Reclaiming what is yours is never a smooth journey. It requires unlearning. It requires listening with the Spirit. It demands the tearing down of strongholds built by years of manipulation. But the reward is immeasurable, because in that reclaiming there is a rebirth. The Book of Jubilees doesn't just retell familiar events, it restores their rhythm. It places time back into alignment. It gives instructions for seasons, rest, and remembrance that follow the design of the Most High, not the structures imposed by empire. And when people live in that order, they live with power. They no longer wander through life confused about their purpose. They no longer wait for others to validate their worth. They remember, and in remembering they rebuild. The restoration of time, of names, of covenant. It begins by reclaiming what empire hoped would stay forgotten. And that process touches everything. It touches how you see yourself. It touches how you treat others. It touches how you raise your children, how you worship, how you move through the world. It brings dignity where there was shame. It brings understanding where there was silence. The Book of Jubilees is not just an ancient manuscript. It is a spiritual blueprint guiding a people back to a place of divine alignment. And once you start walking that path, everything changes. You begin to recognize the signs. You begin to hear the echo of your ancestors in its word. You begin to see that the parts of you labeled lost were only hidden under layers of false history. The return to truth is always met with resistance. There will always be voices that say, "It doesn't matter," or "Leave the past behind." But those voices don't speak for liberation. They speak for comfort, for convenience, for the systems that benefit from your forgetfulness. But when you rise above those voices, when you embrace the uncomfortable questions, when you lean into the truth instead of away from it, you step into a freedom no one can take from you. Because this kind of freedom doesn't come from governments, from wealth, or from permission. It comes from the Most High. And once it is yours, you walk differently, you speak differently, you love differently. Because now you know the act of reclaiming begins in the mind. It begins with the willingness to say there's more, the willingness to believe that your story didn't begin in trauma, but in glory, that your ancestors were not lost but planted, that their blood still speaks, that their journey wasn't in vain, and that your life is not disconnected from theirs. It is a continuation. The Book of Jubilees gives structure to that memory. It becomes a bridge connecting the past to the present, and reminding you that your faith was never born in the shadows of someone else's religion. It was rooted in truth, in obedience, in divine timing, in a calendar of holiness that empire could not replicate. Freedom is not just physical, it is spiritual. And to reclaim what was hidden is to break spiritual chains. It is to see with eyes that were once blind. It is to walk in steps that were once scattered. The Book of Jubilees offers a mirror to see yourself in the reflection of sacred history. And that vision is powerful, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to sleep. You cannot return to the chains of ignorance. You are awake, and the awakening becomes a ripple. It spreads from one soul to the next, from one generation to another. And soon what was once forgotten becomes a movement rooted not in anger, but in truth, not in rebellion, but in return. The first step to freedom is not escape, it is remembrance. The first breath of liberation is not revolt, It is rediscovery. When you reclaim what was stolen, you reclaim yourself. You restore your place in the story of time. You no longer ask permission to be who you are. You simply become, because you always were, and no one can ever take that from you again.